Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Let's read some scary stories. Tonight we have 2 scary stories to sink our hellish teeth into. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Also, if you like this content, then don't forget to subscribe, and if you would be so kind and click that like button. Now, let's get right into it. The worst video isn't on the dark web. Posted by Toucan the Rapper. I wish I'd never watched that video. I thought I'd grow out of shit like that by the time I'd hit 20. Yet there I was, off my tits on some choice MDMA Jeff hooked us up with, touring through some kind of hardcore sadomasochism site. The kind of videos you're surprised aren't on the dark web. If you've ever stumbled across the Pain Olympics or 4chan, you know what I'm talking about. When I was a teenager, my mates and I would gather around a PC screen, playing chicken, to see who would watch the most extreme content without leaving the room or puking. This was like that, but with a tablet, and nobody is sober. In my defense, it wasn't my idea. Luke's cousin was down for the weekend. Young lad, about 16, I think, not too bright, but kept to himself, which meant he wasn't going to get us caught sneaking him in to the rave underage. As usual, afterwards we found ourselves at a flat party, and then in Luke's bedroom. It wasn't until about 4 AM, when those who were able had sauntered off to get laid, that the usual rounds of spliff and internet began. This was when Luke's cousin started suggesting weirder and weirder shit. We all thought at first that it was just the Mandy. He was young after all, and teenage desire to be seen as edgy mixed with come down anxiety was a plausible explanation. After a while though, one of us, I was too fucked to remember who, but I hope it wasn't me, started to entertain his suggestions. Everybody there enjoyed horror films after all. We'd had more than one 4 AM Saw or Hostel marathon after a night out. What was the harm? Soon enough, we found ourselves in the familiar group cringe and out loud awes. There was then, of course, the unending debate over whatever macabre footage we'd just put ourselves through was real. We'd dug to the point of a woman using a kitchen knife to scalp herself, and a man pulling his own toes off with a pair of pliers. When we found it, Luke's cousin was in control by that point. We hadn't noticed how quiet he'd gotten. He sat there on the floor, legs crossed, leaning forward every so often to click the next video. Had this look on his face the whole time, like he was searching for something specific. He never skipped anything though. No matter what the video showed, he just sat back, watching whatever it was, making the rest of us make melodramatic retching noises unfold. Once one video finished, he scoured the algorithm's suggestion for the next. He'd ignored all of ours by this point, so we'd stopped bothering. We were more than a few blunts into our session and holding our focus on anything other than the rich conversation about which of the girls we knew would be good smash was difficult. I remember him sighing disappointedly at every video he found, except for the last. When he found that one, he licked his lips, rocking slightly. He must have known. No way the creepy little fuck found this by accident. When he clicked play, we all knew this one was going to be different. I'm not sure how. Call it instinct. Something was off about it, which was, when you consider the kind of website we were surfing, said a lot. Before the footage started, the rest of us had been laughing and joking in a blunt, smoked haze. The vibe of the room switched in less than a heartbeat. The moment sound started to seep from the tiny speaker, every chemically stimulated mind enraptured by the figure on the 12-inch tablet screen. It was a girl, younger than us, but older than Luke's cousin. Pretty, but not in the conventional sense. I say pretty because she wasn't exactly hot, not the kind of looks you try and buy a drink. She had a pleasantness to the eye that I can't really put in words. To describe her would make her sound plain, almost ugly. Drooping cheeks, large eyes, surrounded by makeup done a little too much, lipstick ever so just the wrong shade of red, hair that had been brushed but was in obvious need of a wash. Not the sort of girl I'd give a second or third look at under any other circumstances. In that smoky room, she was all I could think about. The first 2 minutes of footage were her staring at the camera in front of a grey wall. The shot was well lit and the camera was expensive. All the lines and imperfections of her face were visible. Her mic was clearly pricey too. When she finally parted her lips, the sound of them peeling apart was quite audible. The breaths between her words came through, as though she were in the room with us. She talked for a whole 5 minutes before anything interesting happened. I don't know when the lads had last focused on something for that long. At that time in the morning, maybe never. Luke, Hunt, Jack, Lyle and I all sat on the mattress and beanbags, hypnotised by the movement of her puffed lips, whispering semi-nonsense at us. She spoke a lot about necessity and excess, about evolution and optimism, destruction and renewal, subjects that didn't really seem to be linked to me at the time. It goes without saying I understand it all now, but then it just came across as meaningless word salad. It didn't matter. I would have listened to that face read even something as dull as the Bible for 500 years if given the chance. She said her last words and held up a potato peeler. I didn't think much of it. I was too lost in those dark eyes of hers. She asked us all to remember that everything we do is to achieve perfection. Something like that, at least. The exact phrasing doesn't matter. It's the idea that counts. Perfection. The room, with the exception of Luke's cousin, jumped in unison when the footage cut to black. The switch was accompanied with a loud crash, the sound of something heavy landing on the lowest notes of a grand piano. You can try this at home. The words appeared letter by letter in a white typewriter font, sporadic, detuned piano notes played over the scrolling text, along with muffled grunts and the scraping bangs of God knows what, being dragged across the floor. The hair on my arms stood on end. I wasn't grinning and laughing anymore. I was still high, but barely. From the quick glances I exchanged with the rest of the lads, I could tell they were in a similar state. Everybody, except Luke's cousin, of course. He didn't look away from the screen, his eyes bulging, left one slipping into a slight twitch every time a new character of the message appeared. I happened to be watching him when the next scene started. The look of excitement disgusted me almost as much as the footage that inspired it. The camera had been moved about 10 feet away from the woman. For some reason this didn't affect the definition of her face, the wrinkles of her top lip, the poorly concealed spot on her nostril, the blobs left over from over-generous application of eyeliner and mascara. All were just as clear as when she had been a few inches from the screen. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her drooping cheeks were slick with tears, and they wobbled in time with the trembling of her jaw. Her large eyes stared into the camera, into us, pleading for help. Both sides of the screen knew wasn't coming. She was still holding the potato peeler next to her head. Unlike her bottom lip, her grip was steady. We could see her clothes now. She was wearing a skirted suit, and an expensive one at that. My plan for after uni was to go into banking. I'm versed enough in tailoring to recognise quality fabric when I see it. The sobbing woman had on the uniform of the financially successful. The men stood either side of her were naked. They were each a few feet taller than her, an impressive feat since, even though she was sat down, you could tell the woman was tall. The length of her slender legs was a testament to this. The naked men were wider than her too, by a considerable margin. To say the sweating figures were morbidly obese would be an understatement. How their stubby legs supported their weight was a mystery to me. The hanging belly flap almost touched the floor. Their skin shone with grease, sweat and dirt, and were it not for the fact I knew it's impossible, I would have sworn under oath that I could smell the pungent odour of curdled milk whenever I looked at either of them for too long. The one to her left was holding a transparent bucket filled with a clear liquid that I hoped was water. To her right was a silver tray. I can't comment on what the men looked like. I couldn't see their faces through the orange shopping bags over their heads. The cheap plastic was fastened in place with about a half a dozen zip ties round each man's neck. The crinkled skin pulled so taut that the shapes of their faces were visible. A pair of orange-bound skulls on the peaks of twin mountains of glistening flesh. The only movement from either was the steady in-out of the bag being pushed and pulled by laboured breaths. Excess is the enemy of achievement. There was another piano crash. The letters didn't scroll out one by one this time, but appeared as a single block. They only hanged around for about half a second before the video took us back to the dusty floorboards. Grey wall, sobbing girl, and her hulking guardians. Except she wasn't sobbing anymore. She wasn't smiling either, even though her gaze was directed into the camera. Her expression was blank, still laced with an unexplainable magnetism, but the perk and spark from the segment where she spoke to us was gone. She raised a potato peeler in front of her face. Before I knew what was happening, she dragged the blade down in a single, uninterrupted motion. She didn't wince, didn't flinch, didn't register in any way the sharp metal slicing through the bridge of her nose. The removed flesh rolled off itself into a damp curl as she peeled. It fell to the ground with a wet splat that was far too loud for comfort. Scarlet gushes joined the streaks of dark makeup her earlier tears had dislodged. Pale bone was visible in the wound. The button tip of her nose hung on a thread from where the peeler had found its way too deep, and she had to yank it out. The blood pooled at the dangling chunk, dripping on her expensive skirt. She didn't even blink. Someone threw up. I could smell it. Although the sounds of the hurling felt like they came from some other world, I was lost in the woman on the screen. I couldn't look away, and I didn't mean that my curiosity got the better of me. I was actively trying, putting so much strain into turning my head that veins in my neck began to bulge. My eyes throbbed. The tiny muscles used to move them left and right screamed, threatening to tear from the force I put on them. Didn't work. I was helpless, sat on the dirty carpet, unable to stop watching as she dragged and dragged the gleaming metal. On occasion, the blade would get clogged. When this happened, she would reach into the bucket, whisking the utensil around to remove the debris. Clouds of red bloomed in the water. The whole time her expression stayed unresponsive to the curls of skin piling up on the floor, the crimson wetness that consumed the lower half of her face, the open holes where her nostrils used to be. She should have screamed, but didn't. Part of me knew it was more accurate to say she couldn't. That part of me was the one that wanted to scream too. I was paralysed and terrified. No matter how much strength of will I mustered, I couldn't turn my head away from the screen. I couldn't shut my eyes, couldn't focus on anything other than the scraping of the peeler. Adrenaline and panic took over my mind. My body seemed to be getting different messages from the girl, shearing off her own nose, slice by slice. To my absolute disgust, I had pitched a tent. I had never felt uglier, more repulsive in my life. I'm not a psycho or a pervert. I'm not. All I wanted to do was not watch. The footage must have tapped into something deep, some latent human infatuation with violence in all of us. That's the only explanation. Surely, it's not like a video could hijack your body. Ah, beauty, such minimalism. The piano crash was louder this time, closer to the microphone. Again, the words only lasted about half a second. When the trio returned, the small nub of exposed bone was gone. A triangle of open flesh lay at the centre of the woman's face, her nose now in wet spirals on her lap and around her feet. The cheeks were next. It was around the time that teeth started to be exposed that I hurled. The entrapment was so strong by this point, I could no longer steal quick glances at the boys, but I could hear many of them doing the same. It was a struggle getting the vomit out. I couldn't bend over far enough due to the paralysis, and had to cough it out mouthful by burning mouthful. One of them was laying on their back when the video started. I could tell by the gargled crying that it was Hunt. I felt a tear fall down my cheek, unable to look away from the woman peeling her lower jaw down to the bone, as the wails behind me coughed and drowned in silence. Somebody managed to get out an almost inaudible whimper. Even though my vision was blurred with tears, I could still make out the half skeleton in the video. I watched the screen, spitting up the occasional chunk of regurgitated kebab meat. As the blurred figure reached to her right, the woman took two objects from the silver tray that I couldn't quite make out. The orange-headed blob next to her didn't move, but even through the watery haze, I could still just about make out the steady rhythm of its breath beneath the bag. For the first time in my life, I was happy to be crying. The weakness in character put up a partial shield, blurring and censoring whatever I was about to see. Once the woman had positioned objects next to her dripping half face. You will watch. The crashing came from behind, the unseen pianist slamming on the keys only a few feet away. Something forced me to blink, and I mean that in a very literal sense. It wasn't voluntary, it wasn't a reflex, it was done on command. A command from who or what? I didn't know. My eyes slammed shut and were quickly wrenched open again by an indescribable and overbearing impulse. All traces of tears were gone. The video swam back into focus just in time to catch the downward swing of the hammer. Exposed jawbone swung outwards, the chisel following through and digging itself in the underside of the lolling tongue. The limb muscle fell to her throat with a wet slap, hanging there behind the dangling jaw for all to see. The girl was calm when she placed the tools in her lap and reached up for the partially detached bone. Her expression didn't change when she tweaked it loose, discarding her own jaw on the floor with the skin peelings, as though she had just picked a scab. On top of everything else, the stiffness in my jeans hadn't subsided. Were my stomach not empty, I would have vomited again. As much of self-disgust as the nightmare Luke's cousin had pulled me into. See what she gives for you. She removes all but the most necessary features. The unseen pianist was closer now, but what concentration I still had was focused on Luke's cousin. I could just about see him out the corner of my eye. He was blinking. I noticed that straight away because I couldn't, unless ordered to, laying on the floor, less than 10 inches from the screen. His young face was illuminated a ghostly blue by the light from the tablet. I couldn't pull my attention on him much. The video wouldn't allow it. But I could have sworn he managed to shoot the occasional gleeful glance at the rest of us. I was able to notice him enough to see how his wide grin didn't falter, how the joy in his adolescent eyes didn't fade as the woman on the screen reached towards her own. with the steel ice cream scoop. My eyes burned with each steady flick of the woman's wrist. My eyelids howled at me, fighting a losing war to close themselves, trying, even though it was hopeless, to shield my mind from the sight of those bloodied, once white orbs popping to the ground. I had to cough down empty heaves when the second one rolled towards the camera, the fading pupil locked on my own. It was judging me, and I knew why. The reason I nearly choked on my own vomit wasn't just because of the footage though. The disgust was far more at my own body than at anything the video was forced me to watch the girl to do to hers. I could feel the wetness in my boxers the moment that first eye squelched on the floorboards. Every spasm haunted me, every muscular convulsion scarring me for life. Outside of the nightmare, before it, I had earned the half-joking nickname of Big Shagger on campus. I'd never hated myself for it before now. It wasn't until the girl started removing the skin of her brow like a face mask that the twitching stopped. My brain must have worked out that shutting my eyes wasn't going to happen. My extremities went numb. The heavy knot in my stomach became a rising lightness, an unpleasant floating sensation. That night of being blacked out drunk had left me all too familiar with. The room spinned one way, my insides another. The space behind my eyes prickled. I could feel myself slipping into a blissful unconsciousness. I urged the process on. I was desperate to be out of the nightmare, and if passing out was the only way, then so be it. The hand had other ideas. She obliges, she obeys, she complies. This is all for you. I could feel the clammy grip on the back of my head. The fingers worked their way through my hair, pulling and tugging to make sure I had no respite from my own depraved nature. Every time my head lolled forwards, it would be wrenched back. The fog of unconsciousness fanned away again and again. I could hear sobs and whimpers from every direction that is except where Luke's cousin sat. I could feel his grin, the cracks of his laughter flecking my wet face. The hanging smoke in the air, that stodgy scent of cheap weed, and even cheaper cigarettes grew thicker by the second. It snaked through my mouth and nostrils, coating the inside of my lungs with heavy phlegm that left my breathing like that of a drowning man. I gagged for a final time, blood and bile spewing onto the already vomit-sodden carpet. Perfection. The crashing in my ear canal timed itself perfectly with the moment the woman grasped her own hair and pulled. The scalp came clean off, the fluid motion leaving a glistening skull caked in chunks of red and purple. The text came just as my brain had time to process the final masterpiece. The girl stood tall, proud even, with the two sweating mountains of fat either side of her, the plastic of the bags on their heads still moving with that slow in-out rhythm. The floorboards they stood on were awash with blood, a pile of fleshy curls at the woman's high heels, a single eye staring at the camera on top of it. Perfection. The word sliced through the crystal image. My dick recoiled the instant it was cut off from the shaved half face. To my shock and self-hatred, I was wincing from the sudden removal of the eyeless stare, the tongue lolling free on the jawless neck. My head swam, joints ached, eyes burned, yet, through the taste of vomit and heaving of raw lungs, only one thought crossed my mind: perfection. As soon as I could move, I didn't hesitate. I heard shouting behind me as I slammed the door, Luke and his cousin at each other. Lyle calling Hunt's name over and over, Jack screeching incomprehensible gibberish. I didn't care. I booked it from Luke's room and out into the hallway. Without looking back, I don't really remember the journey to my end of the building very well. I remember taking off my clothes as I ran, throwing the vomit-crusted t-shirt and soaked pants into the corridor. I left my phone, keys, wallet. I'm usually protective of the necessities, but in the wee hours of that morning, they didn't matter. Nothing did, save for removing as much of what had transpired from myself as possible. People laughed when they saw me sprinting naked through the halls, but the laughter quickly turned to shrieks and startled mutters as they came close enough to see the blood and puke slathering my lips. Somehow, I kicked down the door to my room. I'm not a strong guy, but desperation and adrenaline meant the old hinge gave way after 2 blows. Once sure the door was firmly barricaded by my wardrobe, I screamed my way through an hour-long shower. With the temperature up, full, the water scalded my skin, at one point leaving actual blisters on my forearms, but it wasn't hot enough. Neither was the bleach I grated in with a scouring pad from the kitchen. Once drips of reddish water started to drip from the end of my shame, I gave up, collapsing into a sobbing heap on the tiles. When I woke, the shower was still on, but had long since run cold. I dragged myself into my bedroom, glad that the curtains were still closed. Once I remembered that I'd lost my phone, my laptop informed me it was 17:30. I'd slept for about 13 hours. Usually I don't dream after a session. The spliffs and lines take care of that. But on the tiled floor, my dreams had been so vivid, more lucid than I'd ever experienced. Perfection. The word rang and regurgitated over and over in real time. Over half a day of formless contemplation of the meaning behind the word, the revelatory film has instilled within me. Perfection. I checked Facebook and awoke to a horde of messages. The lads had been busy whilst I slept. Luke had killed his cousin. About 10 minutes after I had gone, the argument turned into a fist fight. Although from Lyle's punctuation-free 1,000-word long message, I could tell it was less of a fight and more of a murder. Before Lyle knew what to do, Luke had grabbed his cousin's head, smashing the grinning face into a mirror over and over again until the nose was flat and shards of glass found their way through eyelids and into grey matter. Hunt had choked on his own vomit, but that's no surprise. After killing his cousin, Luke tried to rope Lyle and Jack into helping roll up both bodies in a duvet to dump somewhere. When Lyle refused, Luke had gone at him with a shard of glass. Jack was in no state to do anything, so Lyle grabbed him and they both legged it. The status update at the top of my newsfeed let me know what happened to Luke once they'd gone. Charlotte, Luke's flatmate, was going to need therapy for a long time, maybe forever. She was never one to shy away from details of her grievances online, and this time was no different. Her recollection of events would have been harrowing had it not been for my awakening. Upon barging through his door to investigate strange noises, she had found Luke naked, kneeling on two face-down bodies. I imagine she didn't stick around long enough to find out who they were, or she had been told not to by the police she later mentioned had arrived. But I knew he was laughing, crying, screaming, every emotion it was possible to feel, a shrieking monster surrounded by the dead and shards of bloodied mirror. The part that would truly disturb Charlotte, the part that would give her reoccurring nightmares of what should have been any normal morning, was what he clenched in his hand and mouth. 3 sets of severed male genitals. Judging by her capitalized paragraph, Luke had a large wound between his legs that confirmed one of them was his own. Perfection. Flicking my eyes back to the message told me things hadn't gone much better for Jack and Lyle's flat. They lived on the 7th floor, a fact that Lyle wasn't quick enough to stop Jack exploiting. To prevent exactly what Jack had been planning, the large windows only opened a few inches. Lyle heard the glass smash, but was only able to kick the door through in time to catch the sight of Jack's ankles disappearing beyond the sill. By the time Lyle reached the window, Jack was a red crater on the concrete. A quick glance outside my curtain showed me at least 6 pairs of flashing lights. The door supervisor was talking to a police officer, pointing up at my window. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't have long to do it. Perfection. Lyle's message had ended there. There was no further communication from him, but I didn't need any. Lyle was smart. He would be doing the same as myself, I imagine. Maybe he already has. There was a couple of ambulances outside too, and they don't take away the dead in ambulances. Or maybe they do. I'd never been around a dead body before last night, so I'm not exactly what you'd call an expert. Something in my gut told me that Lyle was in one of them. I could sense him. Awakened mind to awakened mind. I could see him sat in the ambulance, the paramedics shrieking, his head free of the unnecessary baggage that would have allowed him to see their frantic tear-stained faces. Not long now, Lyle. I'll be with you soon. Perfection. Moving the barricade, interrupting my flatmates' romantic dinner, ignoring their screams as I threw the fridge in front of the door, stabbing them until they made no more noise, finding the potato peeler at the back of the cupboard. All of these I found easy. I had a purpose now. I made sure to add the bed to the wardrobe. When resealing my bedroom door behind me, I needed time, a resource that the hammering on the door to the flat beyond the barricade told me I didn't have. I could hear somebody shouting my name, a deep male voice, human in a way that I soon would not be. Perfection. I grasped the potato peeler in my hands. My palms were sweating, but not from nerves. It was anticipation. No, not anticipation. Excitement. The same excitement I used to feel in that moment where a girl throws you down on her bed and unhooks her bra. The plastic pressed into my fingers felt realer than any woman I'd ever touched. I gazed at myself in the mirror, bloodshot eyes, a hooked nose, lips dried out from too many cigarettes and late nights, all of it holding me back, all of it clouding my vision for so long. I didn't wince as the peeler made its first incision. I'm so glad I watched that fucking video. Perfection. If you find my camera, don't email me the damn footage. Posted by Toucan the rapper. Apologies for the aggressive title, but I'm in no mood to mess around. Snappy titles were always Ralph's thing. I hold the camera. My brain works in angles and shots, not words and phrases. I'm only telling my story for two reasons. One, it might make you stay the hell away from the Vegas storm tunnels. Two, if you ignore reason one and you find my camera, this post may mean you don't follow the "if found, please return or email memory card contents" to instructions I always made a point of keeping tucked into the camera case. I can't express this enough. I never want to see what we filmed down there. The thought that there's even a slight chance some naive, well-meaning urban explorer could find my camera and deliver evidence to me that what I've been drinking to forget did actually happen, well, let's just say it pushed sobriety further away than it's ever felt. Hopefully after reading this, none of you will want to go knocking around down there anyway. That's kind of the goal. As my AA sponsor pointed out to me, nobody can find what nobody is looking for. If you've never heard of the storm drain network under Las Vegas, or the homeless community that has set up a city down there, stop reading now. I've already told you too much. You don't need to know anymore. Just stay the hell away from Vegas and live the best and most fulfilling life you possibly can. If you're one of the millions that are aware and have been considering a visit, you're the people I want to grab by the collar and shake furiously until you agree never to give in to the temptation. It's not worth the risk. There's more down there than even the most elderly of the tunnel folk know. The only reason the police aren't evacuating the tunnels as we speak is that I already tried going to them. Because I'm not an idiot. They made it very clear that if I pressed the matter further, they'd have me sectioned. I'm not surprised. As soon as I start talking about this, the terror returns and I start raving like a lunatic. There's no other word for it. Why do you think I'm writing this down and not making a vlog? I did try. There's just no way that level of obvious abject panic, eyes bulging to bursting point and a forehead wet with fierce sweats, wouldn't be interpreted as hard drug use. For context, it was the second time I'd been to Nevada to film the tunnel community. If you search for Las Vegas tunnel community on YouTube, there's loads of videos with view counts ranking in the hundreds of thousands, even millions. I won't say which, but there's one video from a notable indie, not so much these days, millennial focused media company. If you've seen that video, you've seen my first tour of the hidden world below Vegas. I don't want to give away any more than that, for reasons you'll understand by the time we're finished. The second trip, the one with Ralph, came off the back of that. He was a Vegas native, and through hearsay and gossip had come to learn that one of his former schoolmates had found their way down to a subterranean life underneath the desert city. Ralph's idea for his documentary was simple: track down his old classmate, find out their life story and how he ended up living in the dark storm drains below Vegas. It was a good idea. Netflix were interested in the pitch, and so was I. That's why I said yes when he tracked me down and offered me the gig. After I got off the plane, we wasted no time in heading to the outskirts of the city. There are more than 1,000 people living in the drains, and not all of them take kindly to outsiders, especially ones with cameras. I had a contact in the tunnels from my last visit, and I knew which of the wide concrete entrances we could use without risking Ralph or I never returning. Well, that's what I thought at the time. You never know how ignorant you are until life slaps you in the face with your own stupidity. One of the reasons people are so drawn to footage and stories of the tunnel communities under Vegas is how much infrastructure the semi-permanent residents have managed to create. Water, power, even a rudimentary messaging service to get news or requests. Between the various pockets of subterranean activity, my contact, Trish, had access to a cell phone, and arranging for Ralph and I to meet her was much less hassle than the process of slowly gaining her trust had been the first time around. When she met us at the entrance, I was greeted with a hug. Ralph was greeted with a sidelong, untrusting glance. This was even after I introduced him and explained why he was here. Most of the tunnel dwellers find themselves there after living less than legal lives. Some are wanted. Cameras aren't exactly welcome sights, so it took me a while to assure her that Ralph and I were only there to find and interview a specific person. She still seemed skeptical, but agreed to show us around. Trish was skinnier than when I saw her last, although this really isn't surprising. For all the amenities they've managed to jerry-rig down in the damp and dark, a steady and reliable supply of sustenance was never a guarantee. These days Trish was little more than a mess of black hair and slack skin draped across a wire frame. The track marks on her arm painted the rest of the bleak picture. Ralph was lucky he contacted me when he did, I thought. Another few months and she may not have been around to grant us amnesty in the world beneath the strip. Ralph had a photo of his old schoolmate. I'll be honest, I don't remember what they looked like. Ralph showed me the photo several times too. After everything that happened, once we'd made our way deeper into the tunnels, I guess my brain felt it had more important details to hang on to. I'd happily trade any of the flashbacks and nightmares for that trivial memory, but it was just that, trivial. If you know what a MacGuffin is in movies, you'll understand why, trying to scrape together what I can remember of the details Ralph gave me as we followed Trish down the pitch black passages is a waste of time. Trish didn't know Ralph's missing person, but she told us she knew people who would. As I said, the tunnel communities had a rudimentary infrastructure, as well as communication channels. You can imagine that in such a community, safety was always a concern, especially for Trish and the other women and more vulnerable Denisians. If anybody took up permanent residence in one of the dozens of pockets of encampments, the other under Vegas settlements would know your name soon. Trish decided that the best thing to do was to take us to hers and ask around. I won't romanticize it. The tunnel villages aren't all the bohemian countercultural communes some filmmakers like to paint them as, to make a statement about consumerism. Trish found her way there because her dependence on intravenous highs made life on the surface impossible during the daytime. Hers was a story of despair, a sympathy-inspiring, perfect arrangement of unfortunate circumstances. The others, though, some of the others hid from the world above for reasons devoid of innocence or decency. I'd had to warn Ralph about this. There were settlements which had never been filmed because people who went there never came back. Between the 1970s and 90s, there were consistently more than 100 serial killers operating in the United States at the same time, often over 150. That's before you factor in the other real-life monsters like rapists, paedophiles, human traffickers and the like. A lot of people commit horrific acts, and a lot of them are never caught, despite years of intense searching. Let's just leave it at that. It was for this reason that I instructed Ralph to stick close to me and to never shine a torchlight away from Trish. You can understand why I was so furious when, after 20 minutes of following her through the dark, Ralph dropped the torch. "Fuck," he whispered. "Sorry, dude. Hang on." I heard him splashing and fumbling in the inches of water that lapped at our ankles. "Don't worry, bro. It's waterproof. It better be," I muttered under my breath, then shouted, "Trish, hold on a minute." Ralph's dropped the torch. "How come she doesn't need a torch?" the sound of Ralph's voice asked. "Because she lives down here. She's used to it. She can basically see in the dark. Right, Trish?" "Freaky," Ralph's voice replied. Before I could listen for Trish's jokey anecdote about needing to see in the dark to find your way home when you were less than sober, there was a click, followed by the momentary blindness caused when bright lights invade pitch black spaces. I winced. "Trish," I repeated, shielding my face from the torchlight to give my eyes a chance to adjust. Ralph continued jabbering away to himself. "Dude, I'm glad I sprang for the waterproof one. You know, wouldn't want to be stumbling around down here in the dark. Can't make an award-winning documentary if you knock yourself out on a low-hanging pipe and drown in ankle-deep drain-off." He laughed at his own joke, then scanned the passage with the torch beam. The light revealed stained concrete walls, scurrying rats, and patches of moss clinging to the cool moisture away from the desert. As my eyes adjusted to the brightness, I realised what it had revealed. "Trish," I hazarded again. This time my voice faltered, the pitch at the tail end of the question rising to prepubescent levels. "Don't worry, bro," Ralph said, piercing the darkness in either direction with sweeps of torchlight. "She can't have gone far." "She shouldn't have gone anywhere," I replied. The light had only been out for a second or two before it did. Trish had been stood right in front of Ralph, casting a stick-thin shadow on the rippling water as we trudged on. The water was still now, though, and Trish was no longer in front of us. She was no longer anywhere. Trish. The question bounced down the long tunnels, ricocheting off the pipes and vents, peppered along the walls and ceiling. The darkness echoes my voice back to me a few dozen times, taunting me with it, but it offered no sign of our guide. Wait. Ralph's voice came from just behind the torch beam. The absent-minded bravado now gone. Has she actually gone? She can't have done. Can she? I asked, although more to the shadows than to ears, as uninformed as Ralph's. The torch was only out a few seconds. We'd have heard the splashing if she'd run, surely. Ralph used the beam to poke and prod the darkness. Ahead, some more. Aside from the occasional beady reflections in the eyes of the rats, watching from various hidden cracks and holes in the walls, the way ahead was void of life, showing the way we'd just come. The same attention yielded identical results. Shit, 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 shit. Ralph whimpered. He shone the torch under his chin so I could see his face. His inner brows were raised, cocky smirk gone. His "trust me bro" expression was replaced with bright eyes and clenched jaws. I then realised the real reason he wanted an experienced guide. He'd been scared, afraid of something exactly like this happening. Listen, I told him, don't worry, Trish probably just got spooked when you dropped the torch. Let's wait around a few minutes. If she doesn't come back, we'll just turn around and walk the way we came, right? Ralph nodded, gulping. He didn't look too convinced as he went back to patrolling our small section of the waterlogged tunnels with the reassuring illumination of the torch. I'll be honest, there wasn't much I could say to placate him. I'd been fully aware of how dangerous these tunnels can be before coming here, more so than Ralph. All my experience did for me was turn my stomach in knots. Ralph was worried. We may be in trouble. Beads of sweat were forming on my hands and palms because I knew we were. I decided to do my best not to let him see that, though being stuck here with a panicking Ralph was much more frightening prospect than a calm one. Screams carry down here, and you don't always know who will find them. After 10 minutes of waiting, Ralph shone the beam under his chin. She's not coming, he said, eyes still wide and darting. Take me back, now. Yeah, let's go, I replied, ignoring the barked order of his tone. It's crazy to think that, at that point, I still fully believed I'd go back to the hotel, then return tomorrow to meet Trish again. Accept her apology, then find Ralph's friend and make a film good enough to get on Netflix. My genuine concern, as we waded back through the dank, echoey way we'd come, was making sure Ralph didn't get so spooked he called off the project, considering how things panned out once we reached the first splitting of the tunnels. Reading out loud that those were the kind of concerns I had feels ridiculous. Jesus, I'm actually laughing. What a fucking idiot I was. Is it left or right? Ralph was stood in front of the junction where our tunnels split along two paths. He hadn't spoken since we'd set off on our journey. The quiver at the edge of his words told me all I needed to know about how he was holding up. To be fair to Ralph, I was in exactly the same position. The sight of the tunnel forking off made me realise getting lost down here was becoming increasingly likely outcome. Left, I replied, trying to mask my wavering in my own words and utterly failing. We didn't turn any corners when we came down here, I think. Yeah, the right ones at a weird angle. We'd have noticed a turn like that, wouldn't we? Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. We'd have noticed. I admired Ralph's attempts to talk himself into confidence. The truth is, I had no idea whether we'd turned any corners before Trish vanished. I'm pretty sure Ralph knew that too. Perhaps he was playing the same game I was. Maybe he still thought the only thing at risk was the project and our working relationship. The bobbing light ahead of me took a step forward, then shot vertically towards the ceiling. Ralph yelled, and there was a loud splash from the same direction. I could see, in the strobe lighting from the torch spinning through the air, that it slipped onto his ass and must have thrown it into the air as he fell. I tripped on something. What the hell? Ow. The torch landed on Ralph's head, bouncing off his skull and landing somewhere in the water. As with the time before, the impact shocked it out of working. We were again in total darkness. What happened? I asked, ears prickling as they started to perk up and compensate for the sudden blindness. Are you deaf? I said. Fucking hell, that torch was heavy. I said I tripped on something. Something in the water. I could hear the splish splash of him fumbling around in the underspill, searching blindly for our light source. Hold on, I said. My camera has an NOD attachment. You mean night vision? If you're 12, I muttered under my breath, rummaging around in the case, praying I didn't drop any of my definitely not waterproof spare batteries or memory cards. After a few minutes, I'd managed to hook up the NOD lens, in total darkness I might add, and with sweaty palms. There was a ping as the camera whirred to life, and then I was bathed in a faint green glow of the LED viewfinder. I screamed so loudly, cement dust fell from the damp ceiling. At the moment the screen swam into focus. The lens had been pointed at Ralph. He was still sat in the ankle-high river, sifting through the opaque liquid in a fruitless bid to find the torch. It was also pointing at something else, something long and slimy and pooling in the water around Ralph. Hair, a tangled mess of jet black, very obviously human hair. At the centre of the mass, a few feet away from where Ralph was crouched, was a lump that my brain desperately tried to convince me wasn't the back of somebody's head. Unfortunately, I knew this was a lie. I recognised the back of that head. Only half an hour ago, I'd been staring at it as its owner led us through the tunnels. Dude, what the fuck? Ralph yelled in my direction, rising to his feet as he did. Some of the hair caught around his ankle, yanking the lump in the water. Even though the grainy view, I knew the face that turned over, staring pale-eyed and slack-jawed at the ceiling. It was Trish. But it wasn't all of Trish. Other than her head and unkempt mass of hair, the rest of her was missing, gone from the neck down. I registered the bile pricking the back of my throat long after it was too late to stop myself puking. I bent over, retching into the wet void. Man, you okay? What are... I grabbed Ralph in the dark and yanked him towards me, away from the floating web of hair. I fumbled around for the back of his head, pushing his face towards the screen to prove to myself that I wasn't going mad. It was Ralph's turn to scream, and scream he did, a piercing howl, several octaves above what one would expect from a grown man. He also ran. Before I could stop him, he bolted down the right-hand fork of the tunnel junction. I yelled out in the direction of his footsteps, but before long the splashing and his unrestrained wailing were a distant echo, and on the audible horizon. To be fair to Ralph, he wasn't alone in running. Believe me when I say, though, I had no intention of spending any time around Trish's severed head. The reason Ralph managed to disappear into the darkness before I could follow was simple. Ralph was faster than me. I pounded down the tunnels after him. My diaphragm ached, both from running faster than I ever had done and from unleashed panic coursing through my system. I was empathetic toward Trish and her life there in the tunnels, but I'd only met her once. She wasn't what I would call a friend, barely even an acquaintance. I know it's cowardly, but no part of me was concerned with hanging around to find out how she met her unfortunate end. I had one drive and one drive only: getting the hell out of those tunnels. Unlike Ralph, I had my camera to guide me as I ran through the inky depths. Outside the screen, the darkness grew thicker, more crushing. The cloying smell of damp cement and stagnant water swirled and boiled in my lungs, making every pant feel like drowning. I held onto the small LED screen, latching onto it through the haze of blackness and light spots forming at the edges of the eyes. It's at that point when, by sheer accident, my thumb brushing the button, I started recording. Here is when the footage I never want to see starts. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to go away from where I was. The most primal, untainted human emotion, the raw fear only those attempting to flee their own end experience. If you watch the footage, the first 10 minutes is probably an almost unviewable blur of dark green as I run through the endless, pitch black tunnels. Once you hit the 11, maybe 12-minute mark, you'll know what I sound like when I literally piss myself and call out for my mom. That's the point that I found Ralph. I only noticed him because I had to stop to catch my breath, puke again. I was scanning the corridor ahead through the viewfinder, hoping I'd catch a glimpse of daylight, when I noticed a dark shape on the wall, a long, organic-looking object, crudely nailed into the cement with a thick rail spike. It was a human arm. Slowly, and despite protest from literally every instinct I have, I continued to pan along the wall. It was at the third object, a dismembered leg hanging from an ankle, that the crotch of my jeans started to feel warm. It was the last object I saw, the one suspended above the other four, that I started begging the dark to summon my mother, to make this all go away, for her to come and chase away reality, the only way only a child believes their mother can. It was Ralph's face, not his head, just his face, torn from wherever his head was and hanged from the wall on a nail, the grotesque trophy of a hunter I never wanted to meet. It's fun to put them back together afterwards, but they never move. I felt a cool breath on my left ear. The whisper ripped every scream from my lungs. You'd probably hear it as though it was whispered right into the mic like ASMR clip. It belonged to a child, except no child should speak that monotonously No child's voice should have undertones of a blunt cleaver hacking through roadkill. You'd now be at the point of the footage I need for my own sanity to believe it isn't real. You'd see the view turn from the wall, hearing nothing but my rapid fire shallow breathing. Then something white would block the screen. You'd hear the faint splashes as I walk backwards away from it. You'd have to turn down the volume as it swam into focus, as my screams no doubt reached a volume that made the audio peak and distort. You'd be looking at a face, the face of a baby, except that you'd know that it wasn't a baby. No baby is so large that its head squashes and bulges against the ceiling. No baby's face is attached to a long maggot-like body that fades into darkness. Further into the tunnel behind than you can see, and no baby has 4 needle-thin arms sprouting from behind each of its ears. You'd know what you were looking at wanted you to think it was a human baby. You'd know, deep in the most primal part of your brain, that what your eyes were seeing wanted you to think it was a human being because of the red, dripping sack it carried in one hand and the rusted, stained tools it carried in the 7 others. You'd look into its lifeless, glassy eyes and you'd know in your bones why we'd evolved to fear the dark and the deep. Most of all, you'd know that it was looking right at you, and you'd know it knew. You knew that. And that's what it wants. You also count yourself lucky because you'd only have to look at this thing for a few moments. You'd have mere seconds of existential terror before the footage ended, because that's when I dropped the camera. I didn't stop to think about what I'd seen. I don't think I could think, not anymore. All I knew, all I was run, now, don't stop. I hurtled full pelt through the dark, stumbling and tripping as I went, all the while trying to ignore the sensation of a cold breath on the back of my neck. Somehow I made it to the surface. I must have found an access hatch ladder or one of the other ground level entrances. I'm not really sure. When I came to, I was ranting to a police officer about everything I'd seen from behind the bars of a cell. They honestly didn't care about Trish's disappearance. I'd be lying if I said I expected any different. Ralph's remains were found a few days later, and he was chalked up as a victim of one of the aforementioned unsafe tunnel communities. They found none of my DNA on him, or the nails holding him in place, and it was ruled I didn't have the strength to drive iron into concrete, so they let me go. I got the first flight home. That was 8 months ago. I tried to forget Vegas for several weeks, to move on with my life. I'd nearly managed to convince myself it had never happened, that Ralph had been dismembered by a serial killer, and that my brain made up the rest as a defense mechanism. It was 7 months ago that I started drinking. The reason? Because one morning when I was out for a jog in my small, cold and sleepy Michigan town, I noticed something out the corner of my eye. There was a sewer grate by my feet. On the other side of the bars I saw something, a glassy, lifeless surface reflecting the grey Michigan morning light. A face-sized baby's eye. I stood watching it for a few moments. I'd just about managed to convince myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that it was just water at the bottom of the drain, when the mirage did something unforgivable. It blinked. Since then I've been struggling with not drinking myself to death. I leave the house to get booze on the good weeks, attend AA meetings on the bad. I need to believe it isn't real. I need it not to be. I need the pudgy white face following me from the bottom of the river as I walk across the bridge to not exist. Even if a small kid pointed it out to his mum, I need the bus-sized maggot husk a hiker found in the forest last week to be a coincidence, or an outdoor modern art installation. I need the recent disappearance of both my neighbours to be because of a nice, normal, harmless serial killer. So please, if you find my camera, don't follow the instructions in the case. Don't email me the damn footage. I don't want to see it. No, I can't see it. If I see that footage, it means all of this is real, including the needle-thin arms pushing their way up through the floorboards in my basement as I write this. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thank you for listening. If you like these stories, then please subscribe and give a like. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.